I got fired from my job for buying a freezing homeless woman a cup of coffee and a hot meal. My manager told me to throw her out into the cold, and I didn't do it. Instead, I bought her something warm with my own money, sat her down where it was heated, and treated her like a human being. And for that exact thing, my manager fired me on the spot in front of everybody, and I walked out into the parking lot with no job, a 7-year-old daughter at home, and no idea how I was going to feed us. What I did not know, what nobody in that store knew, was that the ragged, shivering woman I'd just lost my job to help was the person who owned the entire grocery store chain. Every store, including the one I'd just been fired from, and what she did when she found out what had happened changed my life completely. I still can hardly believe the arithmetic of it when I lay it out. The lowest, most frightening hour of my life, the moment I lost the floor under my child, turned out to be the exact moment that fixed everything. And it fixed it not in spite of what got me fired, but precisely because of it. The thing that cost me the job was the thing that saved my life. I didn't know that walking out into that parking lot, of course. Out there in the cold, jobless, I thought I'd just destroyed us. We almost never get to see, in the moment, which of our days is the one everything turns on. That one looked exactly like ruin while I was standing in it. I'm going to tell you the whole story, what happened in that store, who that woman really was, and what she did to the man who fired me and to me. But more than that, this is a story about doing the right thing when it costs you something, when there's a real price and you pay it anyway, and what I've learned about who that makes you. Before I start, one quick thing. I'm not a man who's comfortable asking for anything. You'll see why in a minute, so I won't make a big speech. I'll just say that if you've ever had to choose between keeping your head down and doing what's right, and you know how much that choice can cost, then this story is for you. Stay to the end. There's a subscribe button down there, and you can decide for yourself by the end whether I've earned it. Now, let me tell you how I lost my job on the coldest day of the year. My name is Cole Bennett. I'm 38 years old, and at the time this happened I worked at a grocery store, a cashier and stocker on the floor, the kind of job that doesn't pay much but pays steady, which when you're raising a kid alone is just about everything. Because I am raising my kid alone. My daughter's name is Faith, she's 7 years old, and she is the entire reason I do anything. Her mother, my wife, Dana, passed away 2 years ago, and since then it's been Faith and me, just the two of us getting by on a cashier's wages, holding our little life together with not much more than love and a steady paycheck. And I need you to understand how much that job mattered, because it's the whole weight of this story. That paycheck was the floor under my daughter's life. It was her food, her clothes, the roof over her head, the small stability I was trying so hard to give a little girl who'd already lost her mother. I was one missed paycheck away from real trouble, the way so many people are, with no cushion, no savings, no safety net. So when I tell you I knew, in the moment, that helping that woman might cost me my job, I want you to understand that I wasn't risking some abstract thing. I was risking the floor under my daughter. That's what makes this story what it is. Let me make the stakes real for you, because words like tight don't capture it. I knew, almost to the dollar, how many days of food were in our cupboards. I knew exactly which bills could be stretched and which couldn't, which week the rent landed and how little was left after it did. When you live that close to the edge, you carry a running ledger in your head at all times, a constant quiet arithmetic of survival, and you never quite get to set it down. That job wasn't a career to me. It was the thin line between my daughter having a normal childhood and my daughter watching her father come apart. I had already failed, in my own mind, to protect her from the biggest thing. I couldn't save her mother, couldn't keep her from growing up without a mom. And so keeping the small things steady, the food and the roof and the routine, had become almost sacred to me. The one form of protection I had left to give her. That is the thing I was being asked to gamble when Dale told me to throw that woman out. Not a paycheck, my whole ability to keep my promise to a motherless 7-year-old. So when I say I felt the fear, I need you to understand it wasn't cowardice. It was love, pulling hard in the wrong direction. Now, let me tell you about the day, and the woman, and my manager. It was the dead of winter, brutally cold, the kind of cold that's actually dangerous. And on this particular day, a woman came into the store. She was, by every appearance, homeless. Older, maybe in her 60s, in worn and dirty clothes, layered up against the cold, with a couple of plastic bags of belongings. She was shivering hard, and she had that gaunt, hollow look of someone who hadn't eaten properly in a long time. And she came into the store, I think, mostly just to get out of the cold for a few minutes, to be somewhere warm. She wasn't causing any trouble, she wasn't bothering anyone, she was just a cold, hungry old woman trying to get warm. And I noticed her the way I notice everyone, I think, because of how I grew up. We didn't have much when I was a kid, and there were stretches that were genuinely hard, and my own mother had a saying she lived by. There, but for the grace of God. She'd say it every time we passed someone struggling, not as a platitude, but as a genuine reminder that the line between us and them is thinner than anybody comfortable wants to believe. I'd watched my mom give away food we could barely spare to people who had less more times than I could count. So when I looked at that shivering woman, I didn't see a nuisance or a problem or something bad for business. I saw a person who'd had a run of bad luck I'd been close enough to, in my own life, to imagine all too well. I saw somebody's mother, somebody's daughter, a whole human life that had landed her cold and hungry in a grocery store on the worst day of winter. You can't unsee a person once you've actually seen them. And I had seen her. Which meant that what Dale was asking me to do wasn't really remove a nuisance. It was throw a freezing human being back out into dangerous cold. Those are not the same instruction, even if they came out of his mouth sounding like they were. And my manager saw her. My manager was a man named Dale, and I'll be honest with you, Dale was not a kind man. He was one of those people who, when they get a little bit of authority, use it mostly to feel big, and he had a particular contempt for people he considered beneath him. And the second he spotted that homeless woman warming up near the front of the store, his face curdled, and he came over to me, because I was the closest employee, and he said, "Get rid of her. I don't want her in here. She's bad for business. Throw her out." And I looked at that freezing old woman, and I looked back at Dale, and something in me just stopped. Because here's the thing. I knew what doing the right thing might cost me. I want to be honest that I felt the fear in that exact moment, the cold clutch of it. If I crossed Dale, I could lose this job. And if I lose this job, my daughter and I are in serious trouble. I felt all of that. And I also knew, looking at that shivering woman, that I was not going to throw a freezing, hungry human being out into dangerous cold. I just wasn't. There are some things a person can't do and still be themselves, and for me, that was one of them. So I tried, first, to do it the smart way. I said, "Dale, come on, it's freezing out there. She's not hurting anybody. Let her warm up for a few minutes." And Dale didn't like that at all. His face got hard, and he said, "That wasn't a suggestion. Throw her out now, or you can find another job." There it was. Out loud, the choice laid right out in front of me. Throw out a freezing old woman or lose the job that fed my daughter. Time does a strange thing in a moment like that. It slows down. I stood there for what was probably 2 seconds and felt like 2 hours, and in that stretch I saw the whole thing laid out, both roads, with terrible clarity. Down one road, I throw the woman out, I keep my job, I go home, my daughter eats, the rent gets paid, and I become a little, just a little, the kind of man who does that. Down the other road, I don't, and I lose the floor under my child, and I have no idea what happens to us, but I get to stay myself. And here's the thing I realized, standing there, that made the choice for me. The first road didn't actually keep my daughter safe. It just kept her fed. Because the father who comes home having thrown a freezing old woman into the cold to protect himself is not the father I wanted raising her, is not a father who can look his kid in the eye and teach her anything true about how to treat people. I'd have kept the paycheck and lost something I couldn't buy back. Some prices look like they're protecting your child when really they're robbing her of the one thing she needs most, which is a parent she can be proud of. I didn't think all that in words, not then, but I felt it, all at once, and my feet were already moving toward that woman before my fear could talk me out of it. And I made my choice. I didn't throw her out. Instead, I walked over to that woman and I asked her gently if she was hungry. And she looked up at me, surprised, wary, the way people get when they're used to being treated like a problem instead of a person, and she nodded. And I went and I got her a hot meal from the deli and a large coffee, and I paid for it myself, out of my own pocket, money I did not really have to spare. And I brought it to her, and I found her a place to sit where it was warm, and I told her to take her time, to stay as long as she needed, to get warm and get some food in her. I didn't make a big production of it, I just treated her like what she was, which was a cold, hungry person who deserved a little warmth and dignity like anybody else. And Dale watched me do the whole thing, and his face went red with rage because I defied him in front of customers. And he came storming over, and right there, in front of everyone, in front of that homeless woman, he fired me. He told me to get my things and get out, that I was done, that nobody defies him and keeps their job. And I took off my apron, and I set it on the counter, and I want you to know I wasn't even angry, mostly. I was scared, terrified, honestly, about what this meant for Faith, but underneath the fear there was this strange steadiness, because I knew I'd done the right thing, and a man can stand on that even when the ground is falling out from under him. And as I was gathering my things to leave, that homeless woman who had watched the whole thing happen, who had just watched a man lose his job for the crime of being kind to her, looked up at me, and her eyes were full of tears, and she said very quietly, "You just lost your job because of me." And I crouched down so I was at her level, and I said, "No, ma'am, I lost my job because of him. You didn't do anything wrong. You just needed to get warm and get something to eat, and there's not a thing wrong with that. You take care of yourself, okay? Stay warm." And then I walked out of that store, into the cold, unemployed, with no idea what I was going to do. I want to dwell on that moment of crouching down to her, because I didn't plan it, and I've thought about it a lot since. I had just lost my job. I was scared out of my mind. And the homeless woman was sitting there absolutely stricken, taking on herself the blame for what had happened to me, and I could see that she was about to carry the guilt of it out into the cold, along with everything else she was carrying. And I could not let her do that. Even right then, even with my own world caving in, the thing I could not stand was the idea of this woman walking away thinking she'd ruined a man's life just by being cold and hungry. So I got down to her level, and I made sure she understood, looking right in her eyes, that none of it was her fault, that a person needing warmth and food is never, ever the one in the wrong. I think that may have been the single most important thing I did that whole day, more important even than the meal, not letting her carry a guilt that wasn't hers. I didn't know she was the owner. I didn't know anyone of consequence was watching. I just couldn't let a hurting person hurt worse on my account. That, it turned out, was the thing she never forgot. I went home that night and I held my daughter, and I tried to figure out how I was going to tell her, how I was going to keep our life from falling apart. It was, I thought, the worst day I'd had since I lost Dana. I'd done the right thing, and it had cost me the floor under my child's feet. I lay awake all night doing the terrible math, applying for things in my head, sick with worry. I did not regret what I'd done. I want to be clear about that. I never once regretted it. But doing the right thing and paying the price for it are two different feelings, and that night I was feeling the price. Faith could tell something was wrong, the way kids always can, no matter how good you think your poker face is. And I made a decision that night, sitting on the edge of her bed, that I think mattered. I didn't hide it from her, not entirely. I told her, in words a 7-year-old could hold, that Daddy had lost his job because he helped a lady who was cold and hungry, and that his boss had been angry about it. And my Faith, my 7-year-old, looked at me very seriously and asked, "But helping her was the right thing, wasn't it, Daddy?" And I said, "Yes, baby, it was the right thing." And she nodded, like that settled it, and she said, "Then it's okay." Just like that. Then it's okay. And I had to leave the room for a minute, because a child had just cut straight to the center of a thing I'd been agonizing over all night, with a clarity I'd lost somewhere in the fear. I'd been so frightened of what my choice would cost her that I'd half forgotten the choice was, in the deepest way, for her. She didn't need a dad with a paycheck and no spine. She needed a dad she could be proud of, and that night, even broke and scared and unemployed, I was one. The next morning I got up and started looking for work with that little "then it's okay" carrying me. I had no idea the phone was about to ring. Now, let me tell you who that woman actually was, because this is where everything changes. Her name was Margaret Ellison, and she was not homeless. She was the owner of the entire grocery store chain. Every single store, including the one I'd just been fired from, belonged to her. She was the founder, the head of the whole company, an immensely wealthy and powerful woman, and she had been walking through one of her own stores in disguise. Here's the story, the one she told me later. Margaret had built that grocery chain up from a single little store decades ago with her own 2 hands, and in the beginning it had been built on a simple principle, that you treat people right. All people. That a grocery store sits at the center of a community and ought to take care of that community, especially the people who are struggling. That had been her whole philosophy, the soul of the thing, back when it was just one store and she knew every customer's name. But the company had grown, the way companies do, into something huge, with hundreds of stores and thousands of employees. And somewhere along the way, Margaret had gotten worried that the soul of it had been lost. That down on the floor of those stores, far from the boardroom, her stores might not be living out the values she'd built the whole thing on. And she couldn't tell from the executive reports. The numbers all looked fine. So she had decided to find out for herself, the only way you really can, by becoming invisible. She had dressed herself in old, worn clothes, made herself look like exactly the kind of person the world overlooks, and she had been quietly walking into her own stores, one by one, as a poor, struggling, homeless-looking woman, to see with her own eyes how her stores actually treated the most vulnerable person who walked through the door. And what she had found, store after store, had mostly broken her heart. She'd been ignored, shooed away, treated like a nuisance, watched suspiciously, made to feel like garbage, in her own stores, the stores she'd built on kindness. She told me she'd been on the verge of concluding that the soul of her company was gone completely, that it had become just another cold machine that treated struggling people like dirt, that everything she'd built it to be had been lost. She described some of what she'd seen on that secret tour, and it stayed with me. She'd been followed around stores by suspicious employees who assumed a poorly dressed old woman must be a thief. She'd been told to leave places for loitering when all she was doing was getting warm. She'd watched, from inside her disguise, as her own staff, people drawing a paycheck signed, ultimately by her, treated the most vulnerable customers with a casual contempt that horrified her. And the thing that gutted her most, she said, was that none of them were cartoon villains. They were mostly just ordinary people who'd absorbed a culture somewhere along the chain of command that said struggling people are a nuisance to be managed rather than humans to be helped. She'd built the company on the exact opposite belief, and she watched it curdle, store by store, into the thing she'd spent her life trying not to build. She told me she'd sat in her car after one of those stores and seriously wondered whether she should just sell the whole company and walk away, because maybe it had become something she could no longer be proud of. She was carrying that despair into my store the day she walked in. She was just about ready to give up on the whole thing. And then she'd walked into my store, and a cashier had been ordered to throw her out into the cold. And instead, that cashier had stood up to his own manager, knowing it might cost him his job, and bought her a hot meal with his own money, and treated her with dignity, and then been fired for it right in front of her, and had crouched down even then, even as he was losing everything, to tell her that she'd done nothing wrong and to take care of herself. She told me later that she sat in that store after I left and she wept, because after store after store after store of cruelty and indifference, she had finally found it, the thing she'd built her whole company on, the soul of it, still alive, in a single cashier who was willing to be fired rather than throw a freezing woman out into the cold. She said I was the proof that what she'd built wasn't dead after all. It had just been buried under people like Dale, and she had watched the one man who still carried it get fired for carrying it. Now, let me tell you what she did, because Margaret Ellison was not a woman who let a thing like that stand. The next day, I was sitting at home, deep in the worst of it, applying for any job I could find, when I got a phone call asking me to come into the corporate offices of the grocery chain. And I figured, honestly, that it was about my firing. Maybe some HR formality, my final check, something like that. So I put on my one good shirt and I went, with a pit in my stomach, and I was shown up to the top floor, into a big office, and behind the desk was a sharply dressed, dignified, powerful older woman I had never seen before, except I had. Because when she stood up and looked at me, I knew those eyes. It was her, the homeless woman from my store, cleaned up, in a suit, standing in the executive office at the top of the whole company. And I just stood there, completely unable to understand what I was looking at. My mind genuinely could not make the two images line up. For a full day, the woman from my store had lived in my memory as someone I'd worried about. Hoped had gotten somewhere warm. Hoped was okay. Figured I'd never know the fate of. And here she was, the most powerful person in the entire company that had just fired me, behind a desk in an office in the sky, with the whole city laid out behind her through the glass. I kept looking for the shivering old woman in the composed executive's face, and finding her in the eyes and something around the mouth, and then losing her again in the expensive suit. And the strangest part is that when it finally clicked, when I understood who she was, I didn't feel excitement or even relief. The first thing I felt, absurdly, was a flash of the same protectiveness I'd felt in the store, a reflexive, leftover worry for the cold woman on the chair, before my brain caught up and informed me that this woman had not been cold or hungry or in any danger at all, that I had bought a hot meal with my last few dollars for a billionaire. I almost laughed. I'd been fired for showing compassion to one of the richest people in the country, who could have bought the entire deli, the entire store, the entire chain, without noticing the dent. And yet the compassion had been real, and she had needed it as a human being even if she hadn't needed it as a customer. And that, she would tell me, was exactly the point. And Margaret Ellison came around that desk, and she took my hands, and she told me everything. The disguise, the secret tour of her own stores, what she'd been looking for, and how she'd nearly given up finding it, and what it had meant to her, after all that cruelty, to walk into my store and watch a man get fired for kindness. And then she told me what she'd done. First, about Dale. She had, she said, already dealt with my former manager. Not in a cruel way, she was careful about that. But Dale was no longer going to be in a position to throw freezing women out into the cold or fire good people for compassion. She'd seen, through her own eyes, exactly the kind of manager he was and the kind of culture he created, and she was not going to allow it in a company with her name on it. I'll admit, I had complicated feelings hearing about Dale. I didn't hate the man, even after what he'd done. I'd come to understand, over a couple of broke and grieving years, that people get cruel mostly out of their own smallness and their own fear, and that a man who needs to throw a freezing woman into the cold to feel powerful is not a man living a happy life. I didn't want revenge on him. I'd have settled for never thinking about him again. But there's a difference between forgiving a person and leaving him in charge, and Margaret understood that difference better than I did. Compassion for Dale. The human being did not require letting Dale, the manager, keep deciding who gets thrown out into the snow. She handled it without cruelty, but she handled it, because a company that lets the Dales run things will grind up 1,000 vulnerable people for everyone it helps. That, I learned, is what real leadership looks like. Not soft, not vengeful, but clear about what it will and will not allow to be done in its name. And then she turned to me. And she told me she was not just giving me my job back. She said giving me my old cashier job back would be an insult, because I had shown her, in one freezing afternoon, exactly the values she'd spent her whole life trying to build her company on, and that a man like that didn't belong being thrown around by the Dales of the world. She offered me a real position, a good one, with real responsibility and real pay and security, the kind of role where I could actually help shape how her stores treated people. She wanted me, she said, to help her bring the soul back to her company. She wanted the man who'd been willing to lose everything to be kind, helping to make sure her stores were places where kindness was the rule and not the thing that got you fired. I took it, of course. I took it. And it gave my daughter and me our life back. And more than back. It gave us solid ground, a future, security I'd never had even before I was fired. She didn't make me rich. She made me safe. And she did it not as charity, but because she'd seen with her own eyes who I was, and she wanted that working for her. There's a world of difference between those two things. And that difference is the whole reason I could take it and still look at myself in the mirror. If she had come to me with pity, with a handout, with a check to soothe the bad thing that had happened, I think some part of me would have shrunk from it, because a man who did the right thing doesn't want to be repaid for it like it was a transaction. That would cheapen the very thing that made it worth doing. But she didn't offer me pity. She offered me a job because I was good at the most important thing her company did, which is treat people like people, and she'd watched me do it at the greatest possible cost to myself. She made it about my character, not my misfortune. She told me, in that office, "I am not rescuing you, Cole. I am hiring the best employee I have ever personally witnessed. You did, at the risk of everything, what I cannot get people to do when their jobs are safe. That is not something I reward out of kindness. That is something I would be a fool not to put to work." And that framing let me walk into that new job with my head up, not as a charity case but as a man who'd earned it the hard way, which is the only way I'd ever have been able to accept it. But here's the part that matters even more than my own job. Because Margaret didn't stop with me, or with Dale. She used what she'd learned on that secret tour, the cruelty she'd witnessed, and the one act of kindness that had cut through it, to change things across the whole company. She put in new policies about how stores were to treat people who were struggling, the homeless, the down on their luck. She made it official, company-wide, that no employee would ever again be punished for showing compassion to a person in need. That, in fact, it was now exactly what the company expected of them. She told me, point blank, that a single cashier willing to be fired for kindness had done more to remind her what her company was supposed to be than 20 years of executives and consultants ever had. And she didn't just write nice words into a policy binder that nobody reads. She meant it, and she built it into the bones of the company. Stores were given real direction and real resources to help struggling people instead of chasing them off. Partnerships with food banks, quiet ways to make sure nobody was turned away from warmth on a dangerous day, protection written into the rules for any employee who chose compassion over the cold efficiency that a man like Dale preferred. She made kindness the expectation, top to bottom, and she made cruelty the thing that got you held accountable, which was exactly backwards from how it had been in my store. And here is the part that still gets me. Somewhere out there right now, on a cold day, there is a struggling person walking into one of those stores and being treated with warmth and dignity instead of being thrown out. And they will never know that the reason traces back to a cashier getting fired for a cup of coffee on the worst day of his life. They'll just be treated like a human being and never know why. A small act of decency, done at real cost with no audience I was aware of, rippled out into thousands of strangers I'll never meet. I thought I was just refusing to throw one woman into the cold. It turned out I was, without knowing it, helping to thaw a whole company. I got to go home that week and tell my daughter a very different story than the one I'd been dreading. I sat on the edge of her bed, the same spot where she'd told me, "Then it's okay," and I got to tell her that helping the cold lady had turned out to be the best thing Daddy ever did, that the lady had turned out to be very important and very kind, and that everything was going to be all right now, better than all right. And Faith listened, and she nodded, and she said, with the total confidence of a 7-year-old, "I told you it was okay." And she had. She'd known before I did. There's a stability in our life now that we never had, even before the firing. A steady, decent job with a future, a little breathing room in the budget, the constant low terror finally gone. But more than the security, what I treasure is that my girl got to watch the whole arc of it, that her father did the right thing when it was frightening and expensive, and that the world, this one time, rewarded it. She's going to carry that. When some hard choice comes for her someday, and the easy wrong thing is whispering in her ear, I hope she remembers the winter her dad got fired for a cup of coffee, and how it turned out. So, a man getting fired for buying a homeless woman a cup of coffee ended up changing how hundreds of stores treated thousands of struggling people. I think about that all the time. About how you never know what one small act of doing the right thing is going to touch. I thought I was just refusing to throw a freezing woman into the cold, and losing my job for it. I had no idea I was being watched by the one person who could take that small act and multiply it across an entire company. I think about that whole day constantly now, from the good and stable life my daughter and I have because of it. About how close I came to doing what Dale told me to do. Because I'd be lying if I said there wasn't a voice in my head, in that moment, telling me to just throw her out, to keep my head down, to protect my job and my daughter, that it wasn't my problem, that doing the right thing was a luxury a man in my position couldn't afford. That voice was loud, and it was making a kind of sense, the cold sense of self-preservation. And I want to tell you why I didn't listen to it, because I've thought about it a lot. I didn't listen to it because of faith, because of my daughter. Here's the thing about raising a child. They are watching you, always, learning how to be a person by watching how you are, one. And I thought, even in that scared moment, what kind of man am I raising my daughter to think her father is? What do I want her to learn about how you treat people who are down? If I throw that freezing woman out to save my job, and I go home to my little girl, what exactly am I teaching her about what matters? I could not be the man who threw the cold woman out, and then go home and tuck in my daughter and try to teach her to be kind. The two things couldn't live in the same man, so I chose to be the father I wanted her to have, even though I was terrified of what it would cost. And it turned out, though I had no way of knowing it, that being that man was the best thing I ever did, not just for my soul, but for our actual lives. And that's the thing I most want to leave you with. Doing the right thing is easy when it's free. Anybody will do the right thing when it costs them nothing. The test, the real test of who you are, comes when doing the right thing has a price. A real one. When standing up for what's decent might cost you your job, your comfort, your security, the floor under your own child. That's the moment that actually measures a person. And I'm here to tell you, from the other side of it, that you should pay the price. Do the right thing, even when it's expensive. Not because it'll work out like it did for me. It usually won't. There's usually no secret billionaire watching. You usually just lose the job, and that's the end of it. But because the alternative is becoming a person who throws freezing women into the cold to protect himself, and that's a more expensive thing to be than any job is worth. The price of keeping your job by abandoning your decency is the highest price there is. I'd have paid it for nothing and considered it cheap. It just happened, this once, to also pay me back. And I want to be really honest with you about that because I don't want anyone to take the wrong lesson. The reason to do the right thing is not that a secret billionaire might be watching and reward you. That almost never happens. In the real version of this story, the far more common one, the cashier helps the freezing woman, gets fired, and just loses the job, and the woman really was just a struggling stranger, and there's no office in the sky and no happy ending, only a man who's now out of work and a clear conscience that doesn't pay the rent. And I am telling you that even that version, the one with no reward at all, is the right one. Because the clear conscience, the being able to look your kid in the eye, the staying yourself when the world offered you a discount on your soul, those are not consolation prizes. They are the actual prize. They are the only things you truly get to keep. The job, the money, the security, all of it can be taken from you by any Dale on any Tuesday. The one thing nobody can fire you from is the man you decide to be when it costs you. Guard that. It's worth more than any paycheck, and it's the only thing that's really yours. Tell me in the comments about a time you did the right thing even though it cost you, or a time someone stood up for what was decent when it would have been so much easier to look away. I read every single one, and those stories are the ones that keep my faith in people alive. And listen, I'm still not good at asking. But if this story meant something to you, the subscribe button's right there, and I'd be honored to have you back for the next one. Until then, here's the only thing I really want you to carry. Somewhere soon, the right thing is going to come with a price tag on it, a real one, and a voice in your head is going to tell you that you can't afford it. When the right thing has a price on it, pay it anyway. Maybe no one's watching and maybe no one ever rewards it, but you'll be able to look your kid in the eye and you'll get to stay yourself, which is the only paycheck that never bounces.